Hey, everybody, welcome back this week. I will continue along the same path that we've been going for a while now. Everything that's leading up into the Civil War, we still have some pieces that we want to cover. The first one, obviously, if you remember, we talked about the Mexican American War and gaining Texas and gaining what's parts of New Mexico and Arizona. And then I talked with you guys about westward expansion and how that affected people in the lead up to the Civil War. And then Coach Staggs talked about the Oregon Trail. We talked about the Compromise of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise. And all of these things were really just like a balloon that just kept expanding. We just kept finding ways to keep it from popping. Um, if you remember me using that analogy in my video. So, really, when that balloon pops, that's when our country finally decides, yeah, we can't have slavery anymore. This is ridiculous. But we weren't there yet. So, everything that was leading up to the Civil War, there are numbers and numbers and numbers of reasons as to why the Civil War started. But it was really just an addition of all of these things, really just sent us over the edge and led us to going to war against ourselves over primarily one thing. It was several things, but primarily one thing, and that was over the issue of slavery. Today I'm going to talk about Abraham Lincoln. But before I talk about Abraham Lincoln, I want to talk about a couple things. One of those things is the Fugitive Slave Law. I want you to write that down. The Fugitive Slave Law. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law, this required any citizen, whether you agreed with it or not, to return free slaves that had escaped to the North. So, as you know, slavery was predominantly a Southern thing. It was basically a Southern thing. And sometimes the slaves would escape, and if they could make it into the North, then they were technically in free land, and they were free, and they could stay there. But the fugitive slave law changed this, and it said if you have a slave that you know was a slave that has made it to free land, you are legally and constitutionally required to return them to slavery and to their owner. So this made people in the North very uncomfortable, something they weren't morally okay with, nor could they really stomach. And to think about it this way, even if you were like a black American in the North, born, let's say you were born in Massachusetts or you were born in New York, even if you were born there, born free, lived your whole life free as a free black American, if even one person was willing to swear to a judge or in court and say that you were in fact a runaway slave, you could be sent into slavery. Uh, this just blew people's minds, especially in the North. It really became one of the key driving factors to be like, are we really okay with this? How does this make any sense that we're allowing Americans to do this and to have slavery and enslave a human being? And originally it was passed in 1793 and authorized the capture and return of runaway slaves to their owners and the prosecution of a $500 fine to those who aided in their escape. So $500 at that time, is a mass amount. So that's really one of the things that really drives this irritation, more and more irritation between the North and the South. Then we get into kind of the issue of Kansas and Nebraska. Now, I don't want to cover too much of this because it's really going to be covered in depth by Coach Staggs next week in our next video. But Kansas and Nebraska were really some of the problems here with Stephen Douglas. So Kansas and Nebraska were moving to become states in the Union, which would force them to decide whether they were going to become slave states or free states. And this leads us to something called popular sovereignty. Just like you would expect it to be spelled, popular sovereignty, you're going to want to write this down. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the authority of a state and its government are created and sustained by the consent of its people. In short, states' rights. through their elected representative. So, what this drives is the idea that, hey, as a state, if we want to have slavery, you can't do anything about it. And that was really driving this idea of popular sovereignty. And it was really pushing this new, not new, but what they were holding too dear, which was, hey, as a state, we're deciding to do this, and as a country, you can't tell us we can't. And that really created some issues, which we get into with the Lincoln Douglas debates. So, the big thing that I'm covering today is the Lincoln Douglas debates. So, if you didn't write that down, popular sovereignty, you're going to need to know that. So, make sure you write that down. And also, earlier, if you did not write down the fugitive slave law, I would advise you do that as well. So, the fugitive slave law and popular sovereignty, the consent of the people. So, we get into the Lincoln and Douglas debates. Now, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Okay, they decide that they're going to. These are in 1858. You want to know that in 1858, and they're very, very famous in American politics. Abraham Lincoln, and Stephen Douglas were absolute enemies. So they couldn't stand each other. They went up against each other, and the debate happened because of this crisis over Kansas. So if you remember, I was talking to you about Kansas. I'm not going to go in depth about that, but you just need to know it really came to be because of the crisis in Kansas. And Stephen Douglas, he was a senator for Illinois, was a Democrat, but he got convinced to switch to the anti-slavery Republican Party. Lincoln was also a Republican. So they decide to have a series of 7, they called them joint discussions. Really, a joint discussion is a debate, an argument. So they have 7 joint discussions, and the opening speaker would talk for an hour. So imagine one person talking for a full hour, just straight, and you can't say anything. I'm sure that some of you feel that way at home with mom and dad, that I just have to sit here and take it while they just lecture me for an hour. But imagine that, okay? Imagine you're going up against this person and they talk for an hour and you're not allowed to say anything. Then you get a chance second. So you come up second and you get to talk for an hour and a half. Yes, right? You get to talk for an hour and a half. And you can go at the person. You can talk about how dumb they are, how you disagree with them. Their ideas are crazy and whatever you want to say. But you can debate and have your side for an hour and a half. Then at the end, the person who spoke first gets another 30 minutes at the end. So it's an hour for the first person, then an hour and a half for the second person, and then the second person sits down, and the first person gets to go again, and they get to speak for another 30 minutes. So imagine 3 hours of debating, basically just 3 hours of them talking about primarily slavery. So for 3 hours, we're talking about this argument of slavery. Now, some of you might say, wow, I don't think I could sit there and talk for 3 hours about slavery. But I'm going to tell you one thing. I have sat down with many people personally and talked for 3 hours about immigration, about how our immigration laws are wrong, how this wall or that wall or whatever it might be. I've had 3-hour discussions. Why? Because it's something that's going on right now in our lives. We're dealing with immigration. Is it what do we how do we handle this? What's right? What's wrong? Who should and who shouldn't? And we're debating this right now in our country. So 3 hours was not strange, especially when you're talking about slavery during this time. So you have 21 hours of literally arguing about the fate of slavery in America. So, you have to consider that and understand that this is a very hot topic in America at this time, and they're definitely not happy about it on both sides. The North wants it gone, and the South says, whatever, that's not happening because of states' rights. And remember that word, popular sovereignty. So the Lincoln and Douglas debates were very, very, very famous because at this time, the media, they grabbed on to specifically Abraham Lincoln, and they loved him. The media loved the way that he spoke. They loved the way that he argued. They felt like he was very well spoken, and they loved him. And because of that, he became very famous because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the funny thing is, this was really just for Illinois. This wasn't for president. This was just him trying to become a senator in Illinois. And he lost. So he lost the campaign in Illinois, but this really put him in the public very, very quickly. If you think of it, let's think about it this way. So, right, with this recent Trump debacle of Donald Trump being impeached, right? So there are a lot of people that we didn't know during this impeachment that very quickly became famous because of this impeachment. People that you may not have known beforehand then very quickly became famous just because it was such a big deal and the whole nation was watching. So it's the same kind of thing and the same idea that Abraham Lincoln became famous very, very quickly because of this. And because of that, he was later chosen by the Republican Party to run for president. Imagine that. You just lost to run for Senate, but now they want you to go and run for the presidency. And that was pretty crazy. But Abraham Lincoln took it on and he started campaigning and he started going all over the place. And here's the coolest thing. Abraham Lincoln was when voting finally came around for the presidency. Abraham Lincoln actually wasn't even on the ballot in 9 American states. So if you were in a state like Mississippi, which is rampant with slavery, or Alabama or South Carolina, they didn't even put Abraham Lincoln's name on the ballot. You couldn't vote for him. And because you couldn't vote for him, obviously, he's not going to win in your state. But despite the fact that Abraham Lincoln wasn't even put on the ballot in the southern states, that's how crazy they were about keeping slavery alive. Because he wasn't even put on there, and I mean, despite that, even though he wasn't on the ballot, he still won the presidency. And the crazy thing about that is, imagine being in the South and you couldn't even vote for Abraham Lincoln, to wake up one day and go, what? He won? How did Abraham Lincoln win? I didn't even vote for him. Was he on the ballot? Was he even running? I have no idea, because he wasn't even going to be in the talks in the South. They didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't want anything. They were all Southern Democrats who were all about slavery, and he was a Republican against slavery. So, because of this idea of slavery and because of this idea of eradicating slavery, imagine waking up in the South and realizing that person you didn't even vote for or didn't even know was running or didn't show up on your ballot all of a sudden is the President of the United States. And very quickly, things got out of hand. So that kind of takes us back to this idea of the Lincoln and Douglas debates and why they're famous and why they're important. It's because it launched Abraham Lincoln into the spotlight of America, and they knew who he was. And it really eventually led to him becoming the President of the United States, which led to the eradication or the abolition of slavery. So that's kind of your history lesson for today. Quick, simple. What's most important is you need to know that the Lincoln and Douglas debates are very famous and they were very important. You also need to know popular sovereignty, and you also need to know about the fugitive slave law. So, thanks, guys. Missing you guys. I wish we could be in class together. And last but not least, I have been tasked with telling you the good news. Your vocabulary plans, don't do them. They're done. We're not going to do any more of them. Congratulations, you're off the hook if you were not done. If you were done, you're so awesome, and you get a blue ribbon from Coach Crouch for being awesome and finishing them. But if you didn't finish them, you're off the hook. You're welcome. Thanks, guys.